Good morning. Today is August 31st. All right, let's get started. So, Arthur Burns, who was the chairman of the Fed during the 1970s, said in a rapidly changing world, the opportunities for making mistakes are legion, which is certainly true. One way to think about this whole episode is that after World War II and the end of the Depression, and with the prosperity they saw, economists and policymakers became a little bit too confident about their ability to keep the economy on an even keel. They used the term fine tuning to refer to the notion that the Fed and fiscal policy and other government policies could keep the economy more or less perfectly on course and not worry about bumps and wiggles in the economy. That turned out to be too optimistic, too hubristic, as we collectively learned during the 1970s when the efforts of policymakers resulted not in a lower unemployment rate, which was the original goal, but instead in a very sharp increase in inflation. So, one of the themes here is that, and this probably applies in any complex endeavor, a little humility never hurts. There was a reaction to the increase in inflation in the 1970s, and the key person in this period is Chairman Paul Volcker, who remains to this day an influential figure in economic policy discussions. President Jimmy Carter, whose re-election was seriously threatened by the poor performances of the US economy, appointed Volcker to be the new chairman of the Fed. He did so partly because he thought that Volcker was a top central banker who would do what was necessary to get inflation under control. And Volcker, who stands 6 feet 8 and smokes a big cigar, certainly gave the impression of somebody who was willing to take strong action. Volcker had been in office for only a few months when he determined that strong action was needed to address the inflation problem. In October 1979, he and the Federal Open Market Committee, the policymaking committee of the Fed, instituted a strong break in the way monetary policy was managed. Basically, it allowed the Fed to raise interest rates quite sharply. Raising interest rates slowed the economy and brings inflation pressures down. As Volcker said, to break the inflation cycle, we must have credible and disciplined monetary policy. And it worked. In the years after this program began, inflation fell quite sharply. In Figure 8, you can see that from 1980 to 1983, inflation from fell from about 20 or 13% all the way down to about 3%, a relatively quick decline in inflation that offset the problems of the late 1970s. In that respect, the policies of the 1980s were quite successful. They achieved their objective of bringing inflation under control. Nothing is free, however, and one of the effects of these policies was to raise interest rates quite sharply for consumers and businesses. I had just gotten out of graduate school, and I remember that in about 1981 or 1982, looking at the possibility of buying a home and being informed that the rate for the 30-year mortgage was 18.5%. So interest rates were quite high, and as one might expect, that brought down economic activity and effective inflation as well. In Figure 9, you see the unemployment rate during this period. The high interest rates which were necessary to bring down inflation, also caused a very sharp recession. The unemployment rate in 1982 was almost 11%, even higher than we saw in the most recent recession. So there were definitely very negative side effects from workers' actions. As you can imagine, the political pressure on the Fed and on Chairman Volcker was intense. During this period, it was common practice to mail to the Fed bits of 2x4s, and the one on the 2x4s, it would say, "Stop killing construction," or "Save the farmer," or whatever, because the high interest rates were having very negative effects on the economy. I keep a few of these on my desk to remind me that inflation is a concern and that we always have to pay attention to price stability. But this is also an example of why independence is important. If Borker had needed to be re-elected, perhaps he would not have been able to sustain his policy. Instead, he maintained an independent monetary policy. He received at least sufficient support from President Ronald Reagan and from the Congress to be able to carry through the policy, which succeeded in bringing inflation down. During the 1970s, output and inflation were very volatile. We saw how much inflation moved around. There was a pretty sharp recession in 1973 to 1975 after the OPEC embargo. And then there was more volatility in the early 1980s as Volcker brought down inflation and the economy went into recession. Volcker left the chairmanship in 1987, and he was succeeded by Alan Greenspan, who held that position for almost 19 years, from 1987 to 2006. One of Greenspan's important accomplishments for most of his tenure was achieving greater economic stability. As he said, an environment of greater economic stability has been key to the impressive growth in the standards of living in the United States. There was so much improvement in the stability of the economy that the period has come to be known as the Great Moderation, as opposed to the Great Stagflation of the 1970s or the Great Depression of the 1930s. The Great Moderation was a very rare and striking phenomenon. Figure 10 shows the variability of real GDP growth from 1950 essentially to the present. The line shows quarterly growth rates in GDP. So a sharp peak shows an increase in GDP growth and a drop shows a decline in GDP growth. These are quarterly numbers. You can see the bounciness, periods of rapid growth followed by periods of slower growth. The shaded area in the left-hand portion of the graph is a one standard deviation band. Essentially, it is a measure of the average volatility of GDP growth quarter to quarter during the period between 1950 to 1985. You can see that the GDP growth was pretty variable throughout the entire period. There was a lot of volatility in the economy. There were a number of recessions, including the severe ones in 1973 and 1981. Now, look at what happens to GDP variability between 1986 and 2007 or so. The variability from quarter to quarter is much less, and the shaded band to the right shows the average variability of one standard deviation for GDP growth in this later period. It is very striking how much more stable the economy was over this roughly 20-year period. It was true not only for GDP growth, it was also true for inflation. Figure 11 shows basically the same picture. The vertical line in the middle of the graph splits the time period into pre 1986 and post 1986. The graph shows inflation quarter by quarter as measured by the CPI. Again, the shaded bar on the left side of the graph shows one standard deviation, average volatility of inflation in the pre 1986 period. You can see the huge spikes in inflation in the 1970s, and then in post 1976, you see much lower volatility. So both growth and inflation were more stable to a quite remarkable extent, which economists commented on quite frequently. That was the so-called Great Moderation. Why was the economy so much more stable between the mid 1980s and the mid 2000s? Lots of research has been done on this question. There is quite a bit of evidence that monetary policy played a role in creating better stability. In particular, even though workers' efforts to bring down inflation in the early 1980s led to a deep recession and a lot of pain in the short term, there was a payoff. That payoff was an economy that was much more stable, with low, stable inflation, much stable monetary policy, and more confidence on the part of business people and households, and that contributed very, very significantly to broader stability. Remember that Friedman pointed out that there was no long term trade off between inflation and unemployment. One could not permanently lower unemployment by keeping inflation a bit higher. That is true, but in a different sense, low and stable inflation over a long period makes an economy more stable and supports healthy growth and productivity and economic activity. So, low inflation is a very good thing, and the reduction in inflation that occurred in the 1980s was really a global phenomenon. A lot of countries had the inflation problems in the 1980s, but all around the world, even developing countries brought down their inflation rates quite considerably, and that has been a positive for economic growth and stability since the mid 1980s. Not all of the Great Moderation was caused by monetary policy. Other factors, no doubt, played a role. One is general structural change in the economy. An example would be that over time, firms have learned how to manage their inventories much more effectively. The practice of so called just in time inventory management is a practice in which instead of having large stocks of inventory on hand, firms acquire inputs only when they need them for production. Not having large stocks of inventory on hand reduced an important source of fluctuations in the economy because if demand slows down and you have a big inventory, then you do not do any more production for quite a while until you run down that inventory. Improved management of inventories is just an example. I could cite many others of better business practices and other factors in the economy that made things more stable. And it may also be the case that there was just better luck. We had fewer oil price shocks and other things happening, and that too may have contributed to the Great Moderation. But as figures 10 and 11 showed, there was quite a striking change in the way the economy operated after the mid-1980s. All right, that's all for today. Great Moderation and the factors contributed to the Great Moderation. First, monetary policy, and second, just-in-time inventory management. After pandemic, however, the inventory management philosophy of just-in-time was challenged because of this ongoing supply bottleneck. So that may contributed to current ongoing inflation hike, I think, in my opinion. All right. Thank you. Bye. See you tomorrow.